So many thanks for the introduction, Dr. Jean-Pierre. I suppose my sound and my video are fine. So, and a warm greetings to the audience. Thank you for being here today. I'd also like to thank colleagues at the Canadian Sociological Association and the Canadian Association of Sociology of Education for organizing these webinars. In my work, I study what I view as sociology of literacy. My research explores the sociocultural, political, and power relational dimensions of language and literacy education. I'm particularly interested in how learners' interactions with language, reading, and writing shed light on broader social dynamics, especially when minoritized students enter official educational structures. In this presentation, I will focus on the successes and failures of what I call pluralized concepts in language and literacy education, in order to invite us to think more broadly about reformist movements in education that aim to challenge discriminatory dynamics within currently established institutions. Over the past decades, language and literacy scholars have constructed a number of pluralized concepts such as multilingualism, translanguaging, plurilingualism, multimodality, multiliteracies, intercultural rhetoric, and many other pluri, and trans frameworks. These concepts aim to expand what counts as legitimate meaning-making in language and literacy education. They challenge standardized and monolingual approaches to writing, presentation, and communicating by recognizing the value of diverse linguistic resources, writing traditions, and cultural practices. These concepts have successfully informed teacher education and have effectively demonstrated the value of pedagogies that can welcome students' plural linguistic and literacy practices. Pluralized concepts are deeply connected to broader pedagogical movements such as new literacy studies, critical pedagogy, cultural responsive pedagogy, out-of-school literacies, and assets-based pedagogies. All these movements have successfully advocated for welcoming students' home languages, literacies, and cultures into official educational structures. My argument today is that while these concepts are significant theoretical attempts at reform and should continue, it is important to recognize that their impact on everyday pedagogy has often been limited and temporary. Particularly in our current international political climate, which is marked by regressive backlashes against inclusive curricula, these reforms are unfortunately easily overturned. I argue that while we must keep advocating for these practices, we should also look toward what I call post-institutional literacy practices, an approach which is harmonious with sociologies of subaltern cultural autonomy. In order to understand the reformist nature of pluralized concepts and the limited impact, it is helpful to use a sociological lens, which can provide a wider view of the field by incorporating larger institutional, political, and historical contexts. A sociological theory that echoes the same concerns about students' multiple languages and literacies, but at the same time is aware of the possibility of failure to incorporate those into official institutions, is Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. The creators of pluralized concepts often do not make connections with Bourdieu's theory, but as I explained, I use Bourdieu's theory as a sociological framework that closely aligns with the reformist agenda of pluralized concepts. Bourdieu's cultural capital has in fact directly emerged from concerns about official education. The theory helps explain why schools often reward reward some students while marginalizing others, particularly through the use of academic language. As Bourdieu explains, quote, "The notion of cultural capital initially presented itself to me as a theoretical hypothesis which made it possible to explain the unequal scholastic achievement of children originating from the different social classes by relating academic success to the distribution of cultural capital between the classes and class fractions, unquote. Based on this observation, Bourdieu calls for reforming the system to close the gap in academic achievement between the students from different classes. Bourdieu's call for reform, however, does not take the form of naive optimism. He clarifies that unequal educational conditions are not unintended failure of modern state-based educational structures, but a planned objective. The schools help sustain and reproduce social hierarchies and class divisions and functions. In his work, Bourdieu explains how, quote, the educational system contributes to the reproduction of the social structure by sanctioning the hereditary transmission of cultural capital, unquote. So the education system has been designed to prevent social reform rather than to promote it. With this orientation, Bourdieu uses cultural capital theory to explore social and cultural interactions within institutions to show how they normalize and reproduce discriminatory social structures. Similar to pluralized concepts, cultural capital theory explains how the knowledges, language practices, ways of communicating, and cultural habits that minoritized students bring with them into our schools are devalued. It is through this lens that Bourdieu calls for reforming the educational system and with the consciousness of possible limitations. Interestingly, the sociopolitical conditions of Bourdieu's time actually led to some tangible reforms in education. The May 68 protests in France gave public and political expression about the structural inequalities in education that Bourdieu had already theorized. However, the reforms, as sadly seems to be usually the case with these movements, were aborted and followed by a reactionary backlash that demanded a return to traditional approaches. Some educational reforms were implemented under Alain Savary, the Minister of National Education. However, his policies were effectively dismantled when Chauvemois took over in 1984. Through official policies, he shifted the focus away from equity and towards a return to traditional academic rigor and reinforcing a standardized curricula. Currently in North America, we are witnessing a similar backlash in a different political climate. This trend is part of the global rise of ultranationalist movements and institutional resistance to equity-oriented reforms. Currently, we witness coordinated attacks on educational policies and pedagogies of inclusion. Major examples are probably the case of dismantling DEI-based policies in the US, and in Canada, the Quebec government's uncomfortable relationship with multilingual education and multilingualism in general. As in Chauvemois' return to traditional education, these moves reassert dominant cultural capital as universal. This obviously will lead to casting pluralized approaches to language, culture, and knowledge as a threat to academic standards. In this context, it is important to ask if pluralized concepts can actually successfully fulfill their agenda and reform pedagogical approaches. Even previously, within what is now referred to as the old neoliberal world order or the polite politics of the middle, there were clear signs that the pluralization of literacies and language use occurred mainly as progressive theorizations with very limited practical impact. In a 2024 publication, Kanagaraja, who has significantly contributed to many pluralized concepts, acknowledges the unsatisfactory practical outcomes. Quote, despite expansions in resources and approaches for teaching academic writing to multilingual students, and doing so with sensitivity to the language repertoires students bring with them, the dominant L2 pedagogies still take graphocentric literacy as the norm for high-stakes academic writing. Critical thinking, voice, or rhetorical diversity are allowed to enter the text in a controlled manner without deviating from what compositionalists call a standard written English, unquote. So despite decades of reformist scholarship, everyday policy and practice has not been responsive. Moreover, sometimes the reforms demanded by theorists of pluralized concepts are so minimal that in practice they can be ignored. Nelson Flores is an important contributor to racial linguistics, which is closely associated with the translanguaging movement. Flores and his colleagues have used the lens of racial relations to articulate the connection between the undesirable status of language education in North America to colonial history. This has stretched the meaning of translanguaging into a theory with historical and political dimensions. This grand theoretical foundation, however, has usually only led to minimal reformist demands. Let's see how Flores views the implications of his theories for everyday practice, responding to the Common Core Status Standards, CCSS, which are proposed learning goals for English language arts and literacy in the United States. In the following quote, Flores focuses on CCSS to describe the implication of his theoretical model. Quote, the teacher's role would be to recognize that the home language practices of racialized students already align with the linguistic knowledge embedded in the CCSS and other state standards, and to develop lessons and units that build on this existing knowledge. To be clear, teachers in such classrooms would certainly introduce students to new language practices, but without relying on the crude dichotomy of academic and non-academic, unquote. From this perspective, the imposition of standard institutional literacy practices is not as big of a problem as calling them academic. Instead of dismantling arbitrary standardization, which is what is suggested here, in practice, some of these demands are a softer form of assimilation. This conclusion would have puzzled Bourdieu, who went as far as overtly calling all forms of teaching in official educational structures as a form of symbolic violence. He wrote, quote, all pedagogical action is objectively symbolic violence insofar as it is the imposition of cultural arbitrary by an arbitrary power, unquote. Please note, Bourdieu is talking about all pedagogical practices, let alone standardized tests and standardized curricula. I believe that as we continue advocating for pluralized concepts, we need to be as realistic as Bourdieu about the inflexibility of educational structures and also about the prospects of reform. Bourdieu admits that reforming a social field, including educational structures, is extremely difficult, very rare, and often impossible. Bourdieu knew that change is possible only in what he called extraordinary circumstances, or in periods of crisis, such as May 68. Now, the question is, if reform is very rare, if not impossible, what can we do? One suggestion in the current scholarship in language and literacy research is decolonial revolutionary approaches that seek total transformation. In fact, there are scholars who mobilize decolonial theory to theorize rebranded versions of pluralized concepts. This is a very interesting topic, but maybe one for a different presentation. I would like to propose another solution, moving beyond Bourdieu's cultural capital theory and drawing on what I call sociologies of subaltern cultural autonomy. If educational structures won't change, I suggest that we should look towards post-institutional spaces where multiple literacies are either already independently thriving or potentially could be if we nurture them. Sociologies of subaltern cultural autonomy are various and have different trajectories. Here are some examples. James Scott has created the concepts of shatter zones and zones of refuge. These are spaces where people intentionally stay outside the reach of the state and its institutions to escape its regulations, such as those in institutionalized education. Raul Zibeci has written about political and cultural autonomy in urban peripheries, where marginalized communities create self-governing territorial and cultural spaces on the edges of cities. In these urban spaces, communities engage in alternative forms of cultural activity beyond official institutions. John Holloway has introduced the concept of the crack, which refers to transformative moments and spaces within current institutions where people could assert alternative forms of pedagogy that rupture the logic of the dominant system from within. Hassanpour, a Kurdish scholar, offers the concept of sovereignty in the sky, which describes how satellite and digital technologies enable stateless and marginalized communities to construct transnational cultural and intellectual networks that bypass state-based territorial control. Leanne Simpson has written about indigenous philosophies of land-based pedagogy. It is a framework in which land itself functions as a living text and primary teacher. This view challenges reliance on colonial educational institutions as an ultimate educational solution. So what can these sociologies contribute to language and literacy research? In contrast with the reformist approach, the focus of sociologies of subaltern cultural autonomy is not fixing the official structures for more inclusive education. They're mainly interested in what I call locally emergent organic literacies. Organic literacies are textual engagements that grow from people's everyday local lives, interactions, experiences, and cultural contexts. They evolve organically based on individuals' unique backgrounds, social environments, and purposes for reading, writing, and communicating. Not surprisingly, these organic literacies are already multilingual, multimodal, and intercultural. In autonomous cultural spaces where organic literacies develop, there is no need for academic theorization or institutional regulations to implement the use of pluralized concepts. They just already happen. Through the lens of post-institutional organic literacies, we begin to shift our focus away from theoretical and discursive critiques of the system. Instead, we pay more attention to organic literacies on their own terms, rather than treating organic literacies as out-of-school practices that need to be added to standardized curricula. We recognize them as fully developed forms of knowledge and forms of expression in their own right. Moreover, from this perspective, researchers will be able to view organic literacy practices as connected to broader social movements for political autonomy. Organically developed communication practices are always part of larger cultural, social, and political agendas that need to be the subject of the study of languages and literacies. As we can see, a shift from reformist sociologies of education, which offer a poor gamble at their best, we can focus on sociologies that enable sustained autonomous knowledge production in post-institutional spaces. Thank you very much for listening, and